Thanks very much for being here. 91.6% of Victorians aged over 16 have now had a first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. So that number continues to grow, and I want to thank each and every one of those Victorians who've gone and got vaccinated, first dose, second dose. This is how we protect ourselves and each other. It's how we open up and stay open. It's how we normalise this, and as some have termed it, it's how we live with COVID. There are 75.4% over the age of 16 who have now had a second dose and are fully protected by one of the COVID-19 vaccines. 28,232 vaccines were administered in our state hubs yesterday, plus of course significant tens of thousands of doses in community pharmacy, and we thank our pharmacists and their teams for the work they're doing, and GP practices across the state. We thank GPs and their teams of staff, as well as all the staff that are working in our state hubs, pop-ups, mini pop-ups, local neighbourhood activity. It really has been quite an extraordinary effort, and it's why this Friday at 6 p.m. we'll be able to celebrate further opening, further easing, really significant changes as we get to 80% double dose, and then in just a few weeks' time 90%, and a period where so many of these rules will go, and we'll be able to take that really big step. Protected as we'll be by then, more than 9 in 10 people aged over 12 will have been double dosed. We're able to move into a very different phase, one where there's no caps, one where there's no density quotients, one where so many of the things we've had to live with, we won't need to have those imposts and those burdens any longer, because the community have done exactly what we asked them to do, and I say thank you to every single person who's gone and got vaccinated. I just make this point though, there are a lot of second dose appointments that need to be honoured, people who need to turn up and get that second dose. If you can bring your second dose appointment forward, please do so. If you're on the fence, if you haven't quite made up your mind yet about whether you will or won't get vaccinated and be protected by these vaccines that are free, that are safe, that are effective, please reconsider that decision. Please go and get vaccinated. It's the best protection. More than any rules, more than any lockdowns, 2 doses of this vaccine is the greatest protection that you can have for your health and the health of those you love, and indeed the health system for those non-COVID patients who need care and support every hour of every single day. There are 56,000 first dose appointments and 78,000 second dose appointments available at state hubs over the next 7 days. So if you are one of those people who needs a second dose, those appointments are there available. There are walk-ups. If you're on the fence, as I said, there is supply. For the first time in a long time, that's not a limiting factor. You can go and get an appointment, and you can be part of that more than 5.1 million Victorians who have at least 1 dose and are protected from very serious illness. There are dozens of sites that are offering walk-ups without an appointment, and the website has all of those details, and I think the Chief Health Officer is going to speak to some of the stories coming out of our pop-up sites. And again, we're so grateful, so grateful to everybody across the community who's done exactly the right thing, gone and got vaccinated to protect themselves and all of us. There are 817 people that are currently in hospital with COVID-19, 147 are in intensive care, and 88 are on a ventilator. Of the people in hospital yesterday, that's all of those 817, 87% were not fully vaccinated. And of the people in intensive care, so those who are sickest, 96% of those people were not fully vaccinated. That, I think, it's not a statistic, because it's a story of people, but it tells you everything you need to know, that if you're vaccinated, double dose protected, then your chances of finishing up in hospital really unwell are very, very small. I'll put it another way, the protection that these vaccines give you is clearly proven, and they will keep you out of hospital. They'll keep you well and safe, and that's why it's so important that people go and have the first and the second dose. I'm sad to have to report that 4 people have passed away with COVID-19, 3 men and a woman, all in their 80s. And of course we send our condolences and our best wishes to their family and friends. This will be a very difficult time for them. There were 55,679 tests processed and results received yesterday. There were 1,510 new cases of coronavirus, all locally acquired, and that takes our active cases to some 24,715. Now, before I hand to Minister Foley to talk in more detail about the pandemic-specific laws that we have introduced into the Parliament today, I just wanted to provide you with some background. We said that as the state of emergency and as legislative arrangements fell due, we made a commitment some time ago that we would introduce pandemic-specific laws, that we would have a set of measures that were not written with a hypothetical in mind, but were the product of learnings and the experiences that we've all been through, all of us, over these last 20 plus months. That's exactly the framework that we have introduced into the Parliament. This is modelled on the New Zealand law. There are elements of what happens in New South Wales and other states also, but we've gone beyond that in terms of accountability and transparency, the view of experts and the broadest view. Now that shouldn't be taken as a criticism of anybody who's been involved in our pandemic response, particularly our public health team. Under the current law, their job is to be first and foremost concerned with public health. And that's what you want when you don't have a vaccine. Once you move to a vaccinated economy and a vaccinated community, and you've got the protections of those vaccines, when you're in this stage of this pandemic, you need to have a broader focus. And that's exactly what these new arrangements will underpin, a broader focus. They also set us up, having learnt many different things across the journey, for whatever that next pandemic might look like, whenever that might be into the future. It is appropriate that you do what you say. We said that there would be pandemic-specific laws. That's exactly what we've introduced into the Parliament. They are based on some other models in other parts of our country and the world, but they go further in many ways in terms of scrutiny, oversight, transparency. They are the right set of arrangements, and there's been widespread consultation with experts in many different fields to come up with this model, and we look forward to them passing the Parliament. We'll continue to talk with the crossbench as we always do, negotiating in good faith and having these arrangements in place well before those that are currently in place expire in a few weeks' time. Victorians have done an amazing job. All of us have been through so much, but together and by sticking together, we have achieved, well, we're going to be one of the most vaccinated communities anywhere in the world. And I thank every Victorian who's been vaccinated. That is so important. It's also important that we learn from the experience and that we have the best set of arrangements in place for this next phase, for this living with COVID phase, for the normalisation of this virus. That's what the rest of this year looks like. It's what Friday night at 6 o'clock looks like, the 24th of November, of course, Christmas and well into 2022. We're in a different phase and we need specific laws, just as we promised, that will protect us and keep us safe. That was our commitment, that's what we have delivered, and to now talk in more detail about those arrangements, I'll ask the Minister for Health, Martin Foley, to address you.
Thank you, Premier. So our model of reforms to the Public Health and Wellbeing Act that we've introduced today, as the Premier's indicated, are modelled on particularly New Zealand and New South Wales equivalent legislation, but take us further and cements this Victorian Parliament and this public health response as the most accountable, transparent and public health focused system in the Commonwealth. Under the updated pandemic management framework, the Chief Health Officer's public health advice will in fact be more central, more transparent and more present in the public debate than it has ever been. After considering the advice in pandemic circumstances, the Minister for Health of the day and the Chief Health Officer's advice from the public health team around how the current pandemic or disease of pandemic potential is determined, then the Premier makes a declaration of pandemic under that system. A report setting out the reasons for the declaration of the pandemic and both the advice of the Minister and the Chief Health Officer then has to be tabled in both Houses of Parliament. No other state or territory requires that arrangement. This declaration can be made initially for 4 weeks, but can be extended for 3-month period until the pandemic no longer represents a serious risk to the community. And before extending it, both the pandemic declaration of the Premier of the day needs to then be set against what are the bars for continuing it. At the moment, the powers that the Minister has is just to extend it. There is not an automatic consideration of not extending it. This is a further barrier that is put in the way for transparency and accountability to continue the use of what are significant public health powers. So the framework will replace the current system where the state of emergency arrangements are in place and need to be reviewed and extended by the Minister every 4 weeks. That arrangement, should the Parliament pass these arrangements, will be replaced by an even more transparent and accountable system through the Parliament to the people of Victoria. Under that new framework, should it pass the Parliament, once the pandemic declaration is made, then the Minister of the day issues pandemic orders that then put in place the system of how you respond to the pandemic. And they have to consider the published advice of the Chief Health Officer. So these orders replace the current public health directions and become pandemic directions. And they will include things like, you would imagine, we will take advice of course of the day, but things like the next stage of how quarantine for infectious people, whether they be locals or those that come from international circumstances, how they get managed, how potential third booster doses, should they be approved by the Commonwealth, get managed, how we restrict and protect the community from the ongoing but changing risks of this global pandemic. In addition to the range of transparency and accountable measures that this bill will introduce, there are of course a number of stronger checks and balances around the use of those pandemic powers. And that is only appropriate given the lessons that we've learnt over the course of the past 20 so months. One of these measures is the establishment of an independent pandemic management advisory committee made up of public health, human rights and other experts and wider community representatives who will be established to specifically advise on the pandemic response and management powers. The Minister of the day must also consult with any other persons they consider appropriate when making pandemic orders and consider any factor they believe relevant to those orders. Of course, public health orders are at the heart of that. That's why they will be published and tabled in the Parliament. But we've learned over the course of the past 21 months that these powers impact on all sorts of aspects of our community and our well-being and our economy and our mental health and business and community. And it will be the intention of this bill to make sure that all those voices are heard in a transparent way. And not only are they heard, but their views are then tabled in the Parliament as part of that process of arriving at orders. A statement of reasons for these decisions to make pandemic orders, together with the Chief Health Officer's advice and how each order affects human rights under the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, must be published within 14 days of making of those orders. Any advice of the new Independent Pandemic Management Advisory Committee must be tabled in the Parliament. These laws will enshrine a person's right to privacy, with the new framework making it an offence to obtain information that is obtained through either contact tracing or QR codes for non-public health purposes. These protections go further than any other jurisdiction in the Commonwealth. It will also introduce an aggregated offence for people and businesses who intentionally or recklessly breach pandemic orders or directions. At the other end of the framework, it will also introduce recommendations that have been proposed by the Attorney General's Fines Reform Advisory Board to take account of, for vulnerable and disadvantaged people, how the infringement system would work in their regards, particularly taking into account their ability to pay. There is also a new concessional fine scheme to create penalty options for people who are experiencing financial hardship. Under this new scheme, eligible people who receive infringements will be able to apply to the Director of Fines Victoria to have their fine amount reduced. As the Premier said, the Public Health team and the Department of Health established an expert reference panel to guide the government and its partners through this process. There was widespread consultation with a range of leaders and groups in public health, in human rights, in the law, the impact that these arrangements might have on culturally and linguistically diverse communities, impacts on the social services sector, impacts on the wider Victorian community, to ensure that this legislation met the needs of our response now to this particular set of circumstances, but equally to set us up for the learnings for, we hope not any day soon, but we suspect the inevitability of future pandemics. So in this regard, this is a significant set of reforms, and I want to thank those crossbenchers who took up the offer that we made to all crossbenchers and members of the Legislative Council after the Parliament requested earlier this year that we make no more extensions to the state of emergency powers, which we've now delivering on, and that we make sure that we have a fit-for-purpose, democratically accountable, transparent and reinforcing the best traditions of the Westminster system, a series of measures in place that create both public health confidence and wider community confidence in getting us through this particular pandemic, but setting us up for the future for how future pandemics might be managed in an important, transparent and accountable manner. I might ask Brett to add a few more comments and take us through some of the circumstances of both the current outbreak and vaccination arrangements that are in place. Thank you.
Thanks, Minister, and good morning. So just an update on the local government area vaccinations. Always great to provide this update. It's all good news. And again today, just showing that we're getting through our second doses at a phenomenal speed, especially in those key outbreak areas. There are 9 local government areas which have grown in their second dose coverage by more than 10% just in the last week. So, 1.2, 1.3% each and every day. They are Hume, Swan Hill, Wyndham, Melton, Casey, Greater Dandenong, Mildura and Whittlesea. So some of those are our known high transmission areas, but others are areas where we know we needed to lift up vaccination coverage and will protect those LGAs very substantially. All 9 of these LGAs now have more than 90% first dose coverage, and most have passed the 70% double dose coverage as well, or they're very close to it. The real success story of the week is Hume, which has had the highest second dose growth of any local government area, increasing by 11.4%, and that's reflected in what's now happening with the numbers in Hume, with a decrease over the last week or two, continues to decline and rapidly dropping below 100 cases per day. It now has a 70% double dose coverage. That's up from 35% just 4 weeks ago. It's also had the second highest first dose growth of 3.2 percentage points last week, so continues to push on as is required. So it's really great to see that improvement in Hume, given that it was really one of our most substantial outbreak areas, and I really thank everyone in that local government area who's come forward to protect themselves and their families and their local community. In terms of pop-ups, we've had our largest ever run of school pop-ups over the weekend with 17 sites running. They've administered more than 6,000 doses. We'll be running another 7 sites this weekend, a bit smaller given lots of people will be away or busy for the long weekend enjoying those new freedoms, but we'll ramp it up again in the first week of November. And the pop-ups have been a real success story, and there are some really positive and interesting anecdotes by reflecting on these opportunities in the right place at the right time and really bringing the vaccine to individuals. Some anecdotes we've heard, a single mum with 3 kids who came across a cafe mini-pop. She said there was no way she might have been able to manage otherwise in going to a bigger vaccination site, but was able to get to one of these mini-pops. It allowed her kids to be entertained while she got her vaccination. The story of an 81-year-old who lives down the road from a school pop-up, saw it and walked right in and got the jab. A woman with an anxious child who might have been overwhelmed at a large vaccination centre trying to manage that, but she found a small pop-up that was quiet and relaxed and had the support to be able to get her child vaccinated there. A young man whose mate said don't get the jab, but he thought of his grandparent, wondered how he might protect her, saw the opportunity, rolled up his sleeve and felt good knowing that he was protecting himself to protect her. So these are the stories of everyday Australians. They're multiplied 100-fold, 1,000-fold, and so it's really fantastic that we are not leaving anyone behind. Every one of us has a different story to tell about how we got our vaccine, but it's really critical that we reach into all of those individuals who've got various barriers or concerns about getting vaccinated and addressing them, each and every one at an individual level. On our case numbers and trends, the trends in Melbourne are pretty stable. Casey and Greater Dandenong have the highest number of cases with 169 and 140 respectively. And in regional Victoria, Latrobe had 41 new cases and Wodonga 36. They are some areas of significant activity at the moment. As we open up further on Friday night, there will be more individuals who are potentially infectious going to regional Victoria, but regional Victoria has absolutely fantastic first dose coverage and screaming along for second dose coverage. Again, speaking of no one left behind, there really is no LGA left behind in regional Victoria. They are all at or above 94% coverage, the great majority of them above 95% first dose coverage. That is more equitable for a region than any other jurisdiction in Australia. So no one left behind, no LGA left behind, some great mottos to run with. But we have some areas of the state that have been relatively untouched by COVID, so they have to ready themselves for the fact that there'll be more cases out and about across all areas of the state, especially with long weekends, with the opportunity for Victorians to travel across the state. And so that protection from first dose and then full dose vaccination is really critical, again, for every single LGA across the state, and I would argue for every single person who's eligible to get vaccinated, because even in those very highly vaccinated local government areas, and Wyndham's a case in point, 99% first dose coverage, if we look at the cases that continue to occur there, they are overwhelmingly not fully vaccinated. So even though there's only that small percentage of people in some local government areas who remain not fully vaccinated, they are the ones who are becoming our cases, who are becoming hospitalised and are part of our ICU statistics. So we have to go to that very last mile. And as there are more cases across the state and more opportunities for us to be at risk of transmission, we do need to have that vigilance for symptoms. So anyone, again, with the mildest of symptoms, vaccinated or not, really needs to go and get tested. We've had great testing numbers. We need to maintain that. That's a really critical control measure as well. And of course, for anyone who's still to be vaccinated, please step forward to get vaccinated. Regional Victoria's led the way. There are still some LGAs in Melbourne that need a real push, but they, as I've reflected on, have really increased over recent days, and we continue to push through that 80% double dose threshold, which is coming up this week, and we must go beyond. So a huge thank you from me, and look forward to the days ahead. Thank you.
Can I just ask you a quick one, Brett, before you step away?
Sure.
Is that right? Do you feel like you've been sidelined by these new pandemic laws at all?
Oh no, not at all. You know, it's the case for any jurisdiction in Australia that it's for Parliament to make the laws that the population works under. So that's absolutely a matter for Parliament. It's been my pleasure to have worked under the existing framework, but if there are improvements to make, or if there are some changes to make that better reflect the elected representatives in Parliament to make them, then that's how it should be. And I think there have been opportunities to learn a great deal through this, and there are opportunities to look at legislation across Australia and across the world, and I think that's really important. I'll continue to provide my public health advice as central to the responses, but I do think it's an absolute improvement to have those mechanisms of accountability and transparency, but also to have that broad input from an independent body to bring in those broader aspects in terms of the considerations, human rights considerations, charter considerations, more explicitly into the decision-making process. So I'll be just as happy to work under whatever legislative framework we have going forward.
You're currently the person who has to sign off on the public health orders. That won't be the case under the new legislation. Do you feel that under the current legislation, where you have to sign off on it, you've got more power? Because if you really disagree with the direction, you can refuse to sign off. You won't have that power in future.
I'm okay with that. I mean, it's been a heavy burden, there's no question, but I think there are expectations that the elected representatives of Parliament, the Minister in particular and the Premier, should have accountability for the final form that public health directions take. My advice will be my advice, and where there might be a divergence between my advice and ultimately the public health directions that are signed off by the Minister, then there'll be an explanation for that. I'll make account of my advice, the Minister will make account of his, and that will apply, this is not about me, that'll apply for every Chief Health Officer, Minister and Premier into the future.
Is this an admission that it should be the elected politicians rather than unelected bureaucrats that are accountable for COVID decisions from the start?
I mean, it's interesting that unelected bureaucrats become a pejorative term. I mean, that's just about every Chief Health Officer across the country right now. Somebody needs to make the decision. I think everyone accepts that expert public health input into those recommendations and decisions needs to be central. But in terms of the specific framing of legislation, as I say, it's up to Parliament to decide that, and I'm happy to work under any framework I find myself in.
Is it ultimately the case that the government and the politicians have in practice had the final say on decisions anyway, and it's just been a formality that you have signed off on it?
No, my signature on the bottom of those public health directions is very clear in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and the responsibility there. It'll be me going before the courts, or anyone else whose signature is there going before the courts if they've signed off on them, and that's that's been the case with previous challenges. So we take responsibility for putting our name to those directions.
The legislation allows for directions to be issued before there's an actual case. Can you tell us what kinds of directives would need to be put in place before we had an outbreak of a pandemic, or not just COVID, any kind of pandemic?
I mean, it is interesting. The World Health Organization didn't formally declare a pandemic for some weeks after we saw human-to-human transmission with SARS-CoV-2. This legislation gives a kind of lay definition of what a pandemic is, and if we see a virus with significant human illness occurring from it that might have started in animals but is now transmitting between humans, even if it's not in Australia, we might want some of those protections to kick in terms of the biosecurity measures at ports of entry, the screening procedures and the testing that might occur. So I think it's absolutely right that we have appropriate agility to be able to see how we need to respond and ready ourselves, you know, in an appropriate planning and preparedness sense, even if most of the transmission's occurring outside Australia.
The borders obviously is a federal government responsibility, so will this allow the state government, for example, to, I guess, require people to quarantine for 14 days, 28 days on arrival?
I mean, there's always been that intersection. So yes, for first ports of entry, the Commonwealth Biosecurity Act has significant powers that can be applied at those ports of entry, and human biosecurity officers authorised under that Commonwealth Legislation Act, and I'm a human biosecurity officer, and there are others in the department acting under that Commonwealth legislation. But there's always been, you know, the public health powers for state governments to make quarantine and isolation arrangements for positive cases once they've entered into the state as well. So one is a kind of arrival at first port of entry with any of the listed human diseases, and SARS-CoV-2 became another one under that legislation. But we've got jurisdiction for those who are entering into the state to make sure that we protect everyone else.
Minority Sports Minister yesterday said that the matter hadn't been settled, but there's a bit of a, like Tennis Australia and WTA are essentially indicating that unvaccinated players may be able to arrive if they do 14 days quarantine Australian Open. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's not my decision to make about entry into Australia, but I think if someone is unvaccinated, they can be managed through that formal quarantine system, as we've done for all international arrivals to date. So if they're unvaccinated and they're allowed into the country, then we can manage the risk through that formal quarantine process in hotel quarantine or in a dedicated setting.
But given people need to be vaccinated to be able to enter the venues, would there not be a level of discrepancy or essentially hypocrisy if you're allowing some players to play while being unvaccinated?
Well, as I say, not ultimately my call as to whether they're allowed into the country, but if they are, we will manage that risk, and I think it'll be managed just as robustly if an unvaccinated person is there to go through that full quarantine period. At the end of that 14 days, if they haven't developed illness, then they're not going to be a risk in the same way that a fully vaccinated person is a much lesser risk.
Didn't we have leaks though last time when this happened with the Australian Open in the hotel quarantine program? There was leaks at the Hyatt, I think, and there were issues that stemmed from that. Surely that's less likely to happen if everyone's vaccinated coming in.
Yeah, but we're in a different world. We're in a world where we have got substantial community transmission in Victoria, and being fully vaccinated is not a guarantee of not becoming infected or indeed not passing it on to someone else. It protects you very substantially from serious illness, and it reduces your risk of transmission to others, getting the infection transmitting to others very substantially. So none of it's foolproof, but we are managing the risk of transmission both through vaccination and, if need be, the full quarantine of unvaccinated arrivals.
We've got, sorry, just before you go.
I might just add to that. The Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke, made some statements the other day that were very clear. And to my mind, I can't understand why the Commonwealth Government would let anybody in that was not an Australian and had not been double dose vaxxed. That wouldn't make any sense to me. That is a matter for the Commonwealth, though. No one's trying to pretend that state governments issue visas or passports. But again, we've got a very small cap on unvaccinated Australians, either permanent residents or citizens, coming back, $250 a week. They have to go through the hotel quarantine system, and you know, let's not put any more pressure on that by having people come here who could be vaccinated. They don't have any right or entitlement to come here. They're not an Aussie. They need a visa. It wouldn't make any sense to me that the Commonwealth Government would do different to what the Immigration Minister made very clear the other day. But again, that's a matter for the Commonwealth Government.
Those visa arrangements may change by the time the Australian Open comes around. Are you sending a strong signal that if an unvaccinated tennis player will not be able to take...
No, I'm just agreeing with what a Federal Minister said. I thought what he said made sense. And
so
if it changes, well then, as you say, it might change. If it does change, well then you'll be able to ask me that question and I'll have a response at that point.
It's up to the federal government to make the decision, but it could be your decision to ban it from Melbourne Park.
Well, it might be, but let's wait and see what happens. At the end of the day, let's worry about those things that we, you know, the actual reality of this, when and if it transpires. If the federal government has a different view, so if what the Immigration Minister said the other day changes, well then they can explain why it's changed and then we can respond to it accordingly. But like the ball kids will have to be double vaxxed if they're over 12. You know, everyone going there will be double vaxxed. The staff will be double vaxxed. Anyway, I don't know why. I don't think it necessarily becomes an issue because I don't know that people who are not Australian citizens who are not vaccinated will be allowed in. That's what the Immigration Minister said the other day, and I couldn't agree more.
But is the state government willing to make that call, saying if the federal government lets these tennis players in, that you'll say, well, you can come here, but you won't be able to attend Melbourne Park?
Well, no, let's just wait and see what the federal government does, and then rather than responding to what they might do, we can respond to what they actually do. With the greatest of respect, let's just wait and see how that unfolds.
It is a very real reality. It's a reality that the federal government could in fact allow them in if a deal is made. So have you considered what we would do in that situation?
Julie, it's months away, and it's not at the top of my list. It genuinely isn't. The top of my list is getting every second dose appointment filled, getting to 80% on Friday night, getting to 90% by 24 November, repairing the damage that this pandemic has done to us, healing those wounds, continuing the rollout of our jobs plan, making some exciting announcements about events that are going to occur right throughout summer. All those things are a bit higher on the priority list than what might occur in relation to the tennis. It's a very important event. It's going to be a great success. But the federal government's position, they need to be clear about that. I think they have been. I think Alex Hawke was very clear the other day. If that changes, well then we'll respond to that at that point.
Are you expecting the Commonwealth to provide clarity on this in coming days? And if they don't, I mean, surely it's an issue that hangs over this event until and unless it's
I don't think
clarified.
anything hangs over this event other than the absolute certainty that it's going to be a great success, and it will have bigger crowds than it's had for a while, and it'll be, it'll be a wonderful international event. It may look a little different in some ways because the global pandemic won't be over by then. But I'm sure that if the Commonwealth Government needs to provide clarity, then you guys will go and seek that from them.
When will you be speaking to the Commonwealth next and Tennis Australia representatives next about this?
About this issue, I don't know that I'll be speaking to the Commonwealth about this issue. It's up to them to make further statements. I'm going on what the Immigration Minister said the other day. In terms of Tennis Australia, I don't personally deal with them myself. I think Martin Bakula and others will be in pretty regular discussions with them, and like he is with the VRC and all sorts of others. Cricket Australia ahead of the Boxing Day test, all of those things.
I know your government has been saying transparency and accountability is at the heart of this new pandemic legislation. There are concerns that it gives the Premier too much power with very little oversight. What's your response to that?
Well, I saw some comments from one particular person who 2 weeks ago wanted me to have this power. Now apparently it's a terrible thing that I've got this power. So he's rather confused, I think. Whenever people have one view 1 minute and then completely change, maybe there's a bit of a political game going on there, maybe. I'm not interested in that. I never have been. Some people have played politics with this every day of the last 21 months. It doesn't work against this virus. It doesn't keep us safe. It doesn't create jobs. It doesn't repair the damage that this virus has done to us. And I won't be engaging in those political games now. I just refer you to the comments that were made just a couple of weeks ago asking for exactly what this bill does. Now apparently that's a bad thing. Like ultimately, the New South Wales model, the New Zealand model, and to go even beyond that, with the Scrutiny of Vaccine Regulations Committee having a role, the Independent Advisory Panel, the tabling of advice, it all goes a step further than robust framework right now. I think we're up to, I think it's the 18th report to Parliament, and they're like a doorstop. They're pretty weighty. And again, the Chief Health Officer's just spoken about the seriousness with which and the solemn nature of him signing all the orders that he has signed. So it's been a robust process, but we're in a different phase now. We're into opening up, living with the pandemic, living with the virus. Therefore, a broader set of considerations beyond just public health, because we're vaccinated at such high levels. As I've always said, if we got to these sorts of vaccination numbers, we'd have more options. And that's exactly what this bill speaks to, and it's exactly the life we're living. The lockdown's over. This Friday we're going to take even greater steps, and on the 24th of November we'll be down to only a handful of rules.
One of the
And given
concerns.
we're approaching the next phase of the pandemic, would
Yep.
you be willing to have parliamentary oversight of the Premier making declarations for a pandemic?
Well, this is interesting. There is already parliamentary oversight now. There's going to be further parliamentary oversight under the framework we're putting into the Parliament. Let's see how that debate goes. Let's see if there's a majority of votes in both houses for those arrangements. You know, I'm accountable to you, to the Parliament. Like, you know, we have question time, we have press conferences, we have, like, I've sworn an oath. Like, the notion that what I do is in some vacuum. Like, again, this is exactly what the opposition leader asked for. Now apparently it's not the right thing. I think there's some political games being played here, and I just won't get involved in that. I just don't have time for it. It doesn't work, and I'll leave it for you and others to judge. Those who do have time for political games, they're unburdened by having to get things done. We are all about getting things done, and it is so good to have all the options we have at the moment, because so many Victorians, and thank you to every one of them, have gone and got vaccinated.
One of the concerns is that it takes 14 days for the health advice to be made public. Why does it take 14 days?
I might let the Minister speak to that.
So that's a legislative obligation to table the reports in Parliament. You look across any legislation that requires tabling of reports. Some of them are annual, some of them are 6 month. In terms of parliamentary accountability, this is warp speed accountability to the Parliament and through the Parliament to the people of Victoria. And any suggestion to the contrary would contradict that, I think. So let's be clear, just on the 9th of October, the opposition called for, and I quote, "Those who make decisions, politicians, should be ultimately accountable for them. As a general principle, I think public health orders should be ticked off by a minister or the Premier. When it's a minister or a politician, we are responsible and we are accountable to the people. And I think during a pandemic, making legislation that is so wide-reaching, they should be accountable, and those decisions should be accountable to the people." Hear, hear, I say. I look forward to the opposition voting for precisely that when they get the opportunity in the very near future.
And can I just ask you, one part of this bill that's been pulled out is the attributes and characteristics line. Can you
Say that again?
One part that has been pulled out is the attributes and characteristics line.
Yes.
Can you explain exactly what that means?
So in terms of the attributes or characteristics of a pandemic declaration, so we would take the advice from the Chief Health Officer as to what are the natures of a pandemic, which can be fairly broad-ranging, and reflect those in any recommendation that both the Chief Health Officer and the Minister then make to the First Minister, similar to states of emergency declarations, in fact modelled on the Emergency Management Act, bushfires and other floods arrangements, where the Premier of the day then makes such a weighty determination. And then that would take account of the sort of things that Brett was talking about. What is the nature of that particular pandemic? Is it an airborne virus? Is it animal to human contribution? I'm not a clinician, I'm not an epidemiologist. That's why that advice needs to be reflected to the Minister and then be reflected in the recommendations made to the Premier.
In the Equality Act,
In the
Equality Act, it says characteristics and attributes can be defined as race, religion, etc.
In the Equality Act.
Excuse me?
In which act?
The Equality and Opportunity
Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Act.
Yes. Is there any reason why you couldn't have in the pandemic legislation narrow those characteristics as opposed to allowing it to be broad sweep such as, race?
Oh, look, any suggestion that that those are the considerations of the public health processes, that's just really mischief making, ill-informed mischief making. These are recommendations that come forward on clinical and epidemiological grounds, not those kind of characteristics. We're talking the principle. You can only recommend, you can only do what's in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act through the heads of power that are set out in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. those kind of principles are not reflected in the Health and Wellbeing Act, and any suggestion to the contrary is pretty offensive, and one that I refute, and one that will not be, it can't be considered, because the principles of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act don't allow it. It's about public health and well-being, not your status of your race, your religion, your creed, your sexuality, your gender. That's really, if anyone is suggesting that, they need to go back and do legislation interpretation 101 and just question why they would even suggest that. And what it does reflect, frankly, is some of the conspiratorial nonsense that we've seen peddled by the opposition as they head increasingly to the margins and the fringes of civic debate in this issue. Their contributions are increasingly hysterical, not informed by the evidence, and increasingly silly.
Is there any reason, I get all of that point, is there any reason why the bill itself couldn't have narrowed it down to the characteristics?
Well, the bill is narrowed by the principles of what the Public Health and Wellbeing Act's heads of powers are. It can only do what the legislation empowers it to do. It does not contemplate such arrangements. And the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Act separately would prohibit that. Like, seriously, if anyone is suggesting that, then they are well beyond the fringes of mainstream public debate in this community.
I guess on the flip side to Samaya's question, what sort of characteristics would be considered within public health?
Well, I'd take the advice of the likes of scientists and clinicians and epidemiologists, the sort of things that Brett touched on. What's the nature of the particular causes of the pandemic or the potential pandemic that is on its way to the country? Is it an airborne virus disease? Is it an animal to human disease? Is it any number of other? Is it a waterborne disease? Is it, I don't know, what was the bubonic plague? Is it a rat-borne disease? Well, I'll ask Brett to explain.
Look, I would just point out that we refer to attributes and characteristics in some form or another with a whole bunch of the public health directions. When we referred to intimate partners having the opportunity to see other individuals, that's a characteristic. When we talk about people normally resident in regional Victoria having different public health orders applying to them, when we talk about children under 16 years of age because they didn't have a vaccination opportunity, when we talk about vaccinated or unvaccinated individuals in a vaccinated economy, we're talking about an attribute that applies to those individuals. So there are so many, and you need the agility to speak to those characteristics and attributes that might exclude someone from a public health order or that might be directed at someone. So I think they're, as the Minister suggested, benign, but appropriate to focus, very substantial powers so that they don't have a broad sweep, so that they're appropriately directed according to the epidemiology.
Really quickly while we've got...
the word agility there, and I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it. That is because this legislation is not just specific to COVID-19. It is being drafted for whatever comes at us in the next X amount of years.
Indeed. I'm not sure people realise how close the West African Ebola outbreak came to being a pandemic. There were 30,000 cases, 11,000 people died. That nearly spilled over into sub-Saharan Africa and would have been a huge challenge for the world, but a different mode of transmission and different kind of public health approaches in many respects. Still with isolation and quarantine being those pillars, but absolutely we need the agility for any of those potentially pandemic-causing organisms, whether it's another coronavirus or a pandemic flu.
Really quickly while you're at the lectern on another topic, we've got 36 cases in Wodonga today, a similar number in Albury, similar numbers to yesterday. The 3 testing facilities in Wodonga were not taking more people by 9:30 this morning. What are you guys doing to boost testing and make sure that community can cope?
Look, I haven't got the update on that specific location today, but as we've always done, if we see demands, we look to operationalise more testing sites or increased operating hours. It's great that people are stepping forward to get tested. That's absolutely required, but we'll need to see, what we can mobilise locally in order to respond to that.
Can I just clarify, is a restaurant is a restaurant or pub in regional Victoria able to continue allowing both vaccinated and unvaccinated people in their venue if they choose to stay with 10 people indoors and 30 out?
No,
Not after Friday.
Not in
the
phase
same
C.
rules apply. Sorry, just on that issue.
They can do
it has
takeaway.
been- I called that out on Sunday on the basis that it would be a change for regional Victoria, because once you move to one set of rules, then that's got to the higher set of rules, if you like. So that vaccinated economy operates across the board from 6 p.m. on Friday night.
The Minister had earlier said that all crossbench MPs and upper house MPs had been invited to these pandemic legislation briefings.
No, I didn't say that.
Oh,
I think, well,
They were invited to be part of the process.
being part of the process.
yeah.
Crossbenchers and the upper house and the opposition, deny that.
Well,
They say
not
they
here to
weren't
have a
part of the
debate.
process
As I've said to you on many occasions, I am not here to try and solve the many mysteries of the Legislative Council. We negotiate in good faith. We extend briefings to all. Some people are involved in processes. Some people choose not to be, as is their right. But we are there to talk about these arrangements with anybody who wants to be part of that discussion. And then they'll be put forward for a debate and a vote, and we'll wait and see what the will of the Parliament is.
Premier, why is Crown allowed to keep operating given today's findings when any other business would be shut down?
Well, today's findings do not take away the licence. Today's findings are very serious, and it speaks to conduct that is shameful in many ways. But it is the view of the Royal Commissioner that Crown can remedy those matters. Crown can change and reform and be in a situation where they will not behave in that way in the future. I would just say, though, we have gone further than the Royal Commissioner had asked us to in his findings. So penalties have been increased tenfold. Compensation provisions put in place by the previous government will be taken away entirely. And we've also not just put in the special manager, Stephen O'Brien, the former IBAC Commissioner, exactly the right person to do this work. He's literally in the boardroom in every decision, in every way, making sure that Crown does the right thing as a licence holder. But we've also made one other very important change. The Royal Commissioner said to us that Crown would lose its licence in 2 years if it had not satisfied. We could take it away in 2 years' time. We have instead decided to essentially terminate the licence in 2 years unless and until the special manager provides report after report after report to the regulator that Crown is fit to hold a licence at that point. So the onus has been reversed. It is not about us taking the licence away, it's about Crown demonstrating in 2 years' time that they are fit and proper to continue to hold a licence. I know it seems a subtle thing, but it is quite a powerful shift in the onus. Now, I just want to make this point as well. The job of the special manager is unprecedented. I don't think anywhere in Australian corporate history have we seen such an arrangement put in place. And that speaks to two things. One, this is a unique licence. There's only one licence of this kind anywhere in our state. Secondly, the conduct that we have seen has been so appalling that this is warranted. So we set up a Royal Commission. We have followed the recommendations of the Royal Commissioner. We have gone further in some areas, and Crown is on notice. They have to be a very different outfit, otherwise their licence ends in 2 years.
Why did it take so long to examine Crown?
Pardon?
You're talking about this shameful behaviour. Why did it take so long to examine Crown?
Well, look, I would have preferred to have known, we would have preferred to have perhaps been privy to this much earlier, and we would have acted on it much earlier. I can't change that. All we can do is look to what has occurred, set up the highest and most formal process, a Royal Commission no less. That work's been done, and we're very grateful to the Royal Commissioner and his team for the recommendations they've provided. We have accepted them or accepted them in principle where there's some further work to do, and we've gone beyond them. So I think we've established that we and the community are serious about this.
You say you would have preferred to be privy to this much earlier. Evidence of wrongdoing emerged, back in 2019 essentially, and your government waited on its hand until New South Wales had its own inquiry and then handed down their report to actually establish a Royal Commission.
Well, again, Samaya, we've had this discussion before. The notion
You're
that...
saying you would have preferred to be privy
Yeah,
to
but hang on. No. Again, with the greatest of respect, people making claims and findings, there's no equivalence between those two things. Like, we've had a Royal Commission, and it's now got to the bottom of what's occurred. It's clear that there's been appalling behaviour for a lengthy period. If we had known about that, then we would have acted then. But we can't change that fact. All we can do, though, and what we have done, is to fundamentally reform the way the regulator works. And I'm sure if you ask members of the former government, given that some of this conduct was occurring under their watch, if they'd known, they would have acted too, I would think. But what we are doing now, either by announcements we made some time ago in relation to a new regulatory framework, the Royal Commission findings and our response to them as presented today in the Parliament, and the legislation, the steps that we'll take, there can be no doubt that we are acting on this, and we're doing everything we possibly can to ensure that this can never happen again. And what's more, that those who hold the licence are fit to hold the licence. That is very important, and that's exactly what we are doing.
You say you would have acted if a recommendation or if findings were made much earlier. It was your decision not to actually call an investigation or into an inquiry. And just on that point, Commissioner Finkelstein in his report said he would have recommended Crown lose its licence if evidence of wrongdoing that first emerged in 2000, if this Royal Commission essentially was held in 2019 or a couple of years earlier, Crown would have essentially lost its licence. Have you in effect saved Crown by just being too slow to act?
No.
But Commissioner Finkelstein is saying if this investigation and if these
And
findings were made in 2019,
I'm not here to.
Crown would have lost its licence.
I'm not here to play word games with you or with him or with anyone. What we've done today is very clear, and it is unprecedented. There is no other arrangement anywhere in the country where we've got a former IBAC commissioner in the room for every decision, large and small, essentially oversighting every single thing this business does. It is disgraceful in many respects that is necessary, but it is, and we are doing it. And what's more, we've gone further than what the Royal Commissioner asked us to do in some areas, important areas. But let's also not for a moment think that you could just have a Royal Commission, ignore all the findings, go further into take the licence away and not have very significant consequences for tens of thousands of workers and their families. This is more than a balanced response. It's appropriate, and we'll put the bill into the Parliament, and if the Parliament approves those arrangements, then they will be the law.
Who's paying for the special manager?
Crown will be paying for the special manager. Yes, with arrangements that will be outlined in due course.
So the taxpayers won't be paying any money?
The special manager is just that, a special manager, and Crown will be providing the revenue that is needed, the funding that is needed to support the work that he will do and his team. The regulator, however, that's a broader role, and those arrangements are unchanged.
Is it essentially the case that this state's economy is so dependent on revenue from Crown Casino that it just wasn't an option to cancel its licence?
No. And in fact, the licence has been cancelled. The licence ends in 2 years if Crown cannot demonstrate again and again and again via the special manager that they are fit to hold that licence. So again, we don't want to get into semantics, but that's exactly what we have decided. That's not what Commissioner Finkelstein asked us to do. We've gone beyond the recommendations that he's provided, and I believe that's the appropriate thing to do.
If the special manager isn't happy with the progress Crown is making over the next 2 years, could that licence be cancelled earlier, or does Crown definitely have 2 years?
No, well, what I'd say to you is this. It would be unwise. It would be very unwise for Crown to ever finish up in a situation over the next 2 years where the special manager was making unfavourable reports to the regulator, because that will show that the commitments that they've made about change and reform and repairing culture and practice were to be doubted. I would hope that that does not occur. If it did occur though, that would be dealt with in the most serious terms. And the government would then have to reassess whether they were fit and proper to continue to hold the licence on that 2-year timeline. But their licence ends in 2 years, unless and until they can demonstrate, not to my satisfaction, but to the satisfaction of a former IBAC commissioner, that they have made the necessary changes in culture and in practice.
Commissioner Finkelstein said, I'm quoting him directly, perhaps the most damning discovery by the Commission is the manner in which Crown Melbourne deals with the many vulnerable people who have a gambling problem. The cost to the community of problem gambling is enormous. It is not only the gambler who suffers, it also affects many other people and institutions. Do you regret not taking action any sooner to prevent Crown from actually exploiting vulnerable people?
No, Samaya, I'm not here to try and change things that can't be changed. We've put a process in place. When I described their conduct as shameful, I chose that word very carefully. And I'm thinking about those people and many others. I'm thinking about all taxpayers who didn't get the taxes they were owed. We are going to change this. We've had a process, and if Crown do not take this seriously, then in 2 years' time, and potentially before then, their licence is gone. Gone.
Do you take
And we will find somebody else to run a casino licence. This is now in their hands, and in an unprecedented way. We've got a person of integrity, a person of real experience, who will be essentially sitting in that boardroom for decisions large and small, gets access to every document, to the books, to every policy, to every decision. It is unprecedented. It's never happened before, and that is a reflection of those two things. One, there's only one licence like this in our state, and secondly, the conduct that we've seen and the admissions that have been made, even in this process, has been shameful.
You say Crown needs to take serious responsibility. Do you take serious responsibility for not acting much sooner?
So, Mayor, I take responsibility for all decisions of the government, and I think
So you do
I've made
take
that.
responsibility for not acting sooner?
Well, if you want to write an opinion piece, write an opinion piece. But please don't ask me to. Please don't. Like, this is not a dial-a-quote exercise, so I'm not going to give you exactly the phrasing that you might like. You can write whatever you want to write. I've answered your questions, and I don't think we need to be going around in circles on that front any longer. This is what's needed, and we are getting this done. It is regrettable, beyond regrettable, that it's got to this, but we can't change what has occurred. We can only make sure that it never happens again, and that's what I'm focused on.
Premier, on aged care, we understand that many facilities, including state-regulated facilities, are still limiting visitors and things like that. What are the current restrictions with visitors? Are there bans on that?
No, there are a limited number of people. They need to be vaccinated. That we take very seriously the vulnerability, the inherent vulnerability of aged care residents. We know that that's inconvenient for some people. It's difficult, it's challenging, but there are some differences in the way aged care is treated to other settings like hospitals, because an aged care home is a person's home. That's where they live. But there are some rules in place, and they will continue to be in place. I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but they're going to be here for a while. What's more, we're going to be moving, hopefully there'll be some announcements from the Commonwealth quite soon, we'll be moving to booster shots, and the first places we'll start are our frontline workers and those who, because of their age and other health issues, are particularly vulnerable to this, and that'll be aged care residents. So that's going to be, we're going to be very busy over the summer administering those shots.
There's a lot of unhappiness and real emotions from family members who, as the state's opening up, can't visit their loved ones in aged care facilities due to restrictions, despite.
Well, I don't think it's not a no visitor policy. I think if you're vaccinated, yeah, absolutely.
So we have flagged some changes. We've got a cap of 2 at the moment. That is the ceiling, and there are some defined reasons to visit, including psychological support, translation services, advocacy and the like. Those will broaden so people can visit just as visitors, and there's an expectation that that ceiling will be at 5 visitors per day. So I think that's an appropriate balance while we've still got significant numbers of outbreaks in aged care, and while we've still got aged care residents who are dying, who are amongst our daily toll, unfortunately. So there are risks that need to be managed there, but I think the roadmap has laid out that it's opening up. I've found it unfortunate that there are some settings that maintain much stricter requirements for visitors than that ceiling. And that is not through public health directions. That is the facility being, I think, overly precautionary about those visitor policies. And so people should challenge that with the particular setting, and they should recognise what the public health directions say in that regard, so that they're not unfairly excluded from being able to visit family. And we do recognise those key things. This is a person's normal place of residence. This is a home for these individuals. And these are family members who are visiting family. And so we don't want that constrained any more than it should be. There is a mandate for staff to be vaccinated, obviously, that's across the board. But for visitors, because we're talking about family meeting someone in their home, there isn't a requirement for vaccination, but they do need to manage in terms of that attestation that they're not symptomatic, and in terms of doing everything else from an infection prevention and control point of view that the facility requires of them. But I think those changes at the phase C mark will be welcome.
Are sporting clubs free to impose their own vaccination mandates? I understand the government of Cricket Victoria has said vaccine status won't impact someone's ability to play or train outdoors, but are they able to, I guess, override that?
I'm not an employment law expert, but I imagine that there are all kinds of organisations and agencies that can use employment law to impose vaccination requirements on employees.
I think this is the first time you've been at a presser since the 90% changes were announced on Sunday. Are you comfortable with them and the impact that they may or may not have, hopefully won't have, but could well have on hospitals?
Yeah, I'm hopeful we'll get there. I think we are absolutely heading there, and I'm confident that when we get to that very high level of vaccination coverage, that we'll be in a really strong position. But it is a month away, and as we've always said, whether it's the 70%, 80% or any other threshold, we need to look at the epidemiology at the time to be happy that they can be written in public health directions.
And is there a reason you weren't at Sunday's presser? Did you just happen to have a day off?
I don't believe it was a day off, but I wasn't at the presser, no.
Are you comfortable with the speed that we're opening out? There was additional restrictions relaxed. You're entirely comfortable with how we're going and how we're opening?
Yeah, as I say, whenever something's written into a public health direction, you have to have comfort with it. If your signature's on the bottom of the page, we talk through these things. None of it's without risk, and we know that there's a trade-off. There are awful pressures for our healthcare workers in dealing with our current caseload. I cannot imagine what it would be like if we had an entirely unvaccinated population. You know, these are some of the reasons why the restrictions have been in place for as long as they have, but it's fantastic to get to a juncture where we can provide for some of those freedoms that people want and deserve.
Based on the based on the last couple of days' case numbers, do you think we have reached that peak and cases going to start trending down?
I think so. It's not going to be a dramatic decrease in numbers. We're opening up after all, but I think we have seen that peak, and I think we're slowly trending down. It will go up again. We're opening up and there will be greater transmission, but that real protection is, as we've always said, higher and higher vaccination coverage, and that is especially protecting our numbers in ICU, which are pretty stable, and the same for hospitalisation, sitting around the 800 mark and really hasn't moved significantly for a week or two now. That's very positive to reflect on.
I have one for the Premier just on the class action that doctors have taken, saying that they're overworked and tired and about unpaid leave. Are you worried about that?
Given that you've just referred me to legal action that is or will soon be on foot, I'm not able to comment. What I will say though is one of the great privileges of my public life, and this year at a very personal level, I have worked with and always revered the work of everyone who works in our hospitals. They do an amazing job. As a father, as a patient this year, as a health minister and premier, I know and understand how hard that work is, and I say thank you to every one of them. And it's not just clinical staff, it's cooks and cleaners and ward clerks and car park attendants. It's a team. Healthcare is delivered by teams of people, and they do an amazing job. We've asked a lot of them this year and last year. We ask a lot of them every single day, and they keep on delivering, as we've heard from doctors and nurses, AMBOs, from this very stage. They do amazing work, and we're very grateful to them. But I'm afraid I can't be drawn into commenting on legal action.
Just back
I'm not
on
sure if
the
this is-
pandemic legislation, is it correct?
I can be here all through question time, it's fine. Others may have some problems with that, but anyway, that's fine.
Is it correct that the independent advisory committee will be appointed by the minister and that their advice will be non-binding? And if that is the case, what's the point, given that the
No, but hang on a
minister
minute.
appoints them and he's
Yeah,
free to
but
ignore their
this,
advice?
hang on, this gets incredibly circular. So, okay, if people who have advocated that the responsibility and accountability should be with the minister, like if that's what you said 2 weeks ago, then you're kind of stuck. Like you can't then just suddenly say, actually, no, it's not the minister, it's a panel of 15 people. And if they weren't chosen by the minister, who would they be chosen by? We're going to have an election? Oh, that's right, we have one of those every 4 years to elect a government. So I know there are some people who are bitterly disappointed with the outcome of the election last time. They're not the government. The notion that they can assume the responsibilities of the government, that's not how our system works. The minister's accountable. He'll be accountable, any minister will be accountable for all the decisions they make, all the orders they make, all the appointments they make. But you can't have it both ways. You can't 2 weeks ago say, we don't want the Cho to have these powers, we want a minister or the Premier to have these powers. And then when a bill gets put in the Parliament that delivers, that's right, exactly that outcome, suddenly that's a bad thing. I think that there's some political games being played here, and I think Victorians see right through this. Politics does not work against this virus. I frankly have spent more time talking about that side of politics at this press conference than I care to. The bill is there, they're either going to vote for it or against it. They'll do whatever's in their political interests, I reckon, because that's what they've done every day of this pandemic. And Victorians know it.
Is it right that the advice of that committee is non-binding? Doesn't that essentially mean that
But they're not the
they're
minister though,
able
Julie,
to
that's the
veto
point I'm
the
making.
power?
They're not the minister. They're not the minister. So this is, just back to what I said a moment ago, this is exactly what the opposition said they wanted. So hang on, who's making the decision? Is it a panel of experts? Is it the Chief Health Officer? Is it the Minister or the Premier? The opposition 2 weeks ago said that it should be the Minister and the Premier. Now apparently they want it to be a group of experts who are elected by, what, the entire Victorian community every 4 years or something? That we have elections to elect a government.
So how is
This
that
is
a
an
check-
incredibly circular argument and it's a political game.
How
And
is it a check and balance if they're not able to step in and make any changes?
well, hang on a minute, they're not the minister, they're advisors, they're not the minister. And if any of them are upset with the process, I'm pretty sure they'll be talking to you or anybody else that cares to ask them about process. That's how our system works. If we're going to devolve this down to literally 6 million Victorians, so whatever, everybody's responsible for this. Look, ultimately, we have processes, we elect governments, we pass laws, we have decision making that is as transparent and as accountable as it can be. And I just go back to you, we're doing what we said we'd do. There are some other people out there who 2 weeks ago said that this is what they wanted, it's now happened, and now they're unhappy about it. That to me is the definition of people playing political games. I'll leave them to do that. I'm far too busy working for the people of this state to play those sorts of games.
The penalty for an aggravated offence for individuals is 500 penalty units. That's almost $100,000. What's the definition of an aggravated offence? Is it, inciting protests, for example, people attending protests?
I might let Martin speak to that, but it's an offence and a breach in the highest order. That's why the penalty is high.
Thanks, Premier. So each case would have to be determined on its merits by an appropriate judicial officer. These benchmarks are set through all sorts of other justice pieces of legislation and precedent, but it is a very high benchmark, and it's for the most egregious and deliberate of offences that cause significant public harm.
So it wouldn't be...
What are some of the examples?
Look, you wouldn't want to
I know it's not
predict,
clear.
but
Yeah, of course.
if an individual or a corporate entity deliberately flouted public health orders so as to potentially infect and undermine the health system's capacity and spread whatever the pandemic is, deliberately, knowingly, and against public health orders, then that would be subject to the benchmarks that's set in the legislation and other relevant pieces of legislation, that egregious level.
So is it if you
or-
I can't give you a commentary on every possible
No, I know.
example because
But
the
we've
examples
seen-
are infinite.
But
Like
we've seen
attending
some
an illegal
major
protest?
examples of protests, for example, that's been a major,
Well,
you know,
that
major
wouldn't be a
issue.
matter for a minister. That would be a matter for enforcement agencies. And rather than run a commentary on what the independent arm of enforcing these arrangements, be it Victoria Police, be it authorised officers, you know, they are independent from government for very good reason, but they apply the laws for fines, whether it be this act or any other act. And it's not for the ministers of the day to tell them or run a commentary on that. That's why they are arm's length from government. Each of those cases would be determined on its merit against that benchmark of the
But
legislation.
to confirm, this wouldn't be the government trying to stop an anti-vaccine protest from happening, this new offence? It would be for more serious or deliberate?
Oh, yeah, look, and again, I'm not going to run a commentary on this falls in and this doesn't, but it would be the most egregious and serious of offences as determined by enforcement agencies at the time.
So probably
Protests
more in
could
line
fall
with
under
the
this.
fines that we've got at the moment for businesses or large companies that don't comply. I think it's $108,000.
Yes,
So
I
it's more
believe.
in line with that for letting unvaccinated people attend a premise.
So that's why at the other end, it's now a more nuanced arrangement, and you will have seen in recent times through public health orders, a more graduated level of fines has also been brought in to take account of the range of circumstances. We've learnt a lot over the course of the last 21 months, and this bill, with particular pandemic powers and all the arrangements that go as part of that, reflect those learnings, both to get us out of this pandemic and to set us up for, I hope not any day soon, but to have us have the learnings of this past 21 months embedded in legislation with best practice administrative arrangements and locking in accountability, transparency, human rights and the public health system at the heart of what governments do. And I'm very proud of this piece of legislation. I want to thank all those crossbenchers who constructively engaged, and I look forward to its processes through the Parliament to make Victorians safer. And I've got to get to question time.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's 2:00 today. I think it's 2.
Yeah. I'm shivering today. I feel like
Yeah, I'm so grateful for like fasting coffee.